Thank you to everyone for joining us for this afternoon conversation. I think that it goes without saying that we're living in interesting times on so many levels. Wherever you are, whether you're in Washington or anywhere else in the country, we hope you're well and we hope you and your family are safe. I'm here this afternoon to really engage in a conversation about some of what's happening at the national level and to both get an understanding of it and to engage in a dialogue in terms of where do we see things and where is there maybe room for hope and what work needs to happen for us to really see the change that we all believe is desperately needed within our society, particularly as it relates to issues of racial equity and where we've been. And so with that, I'm joined this afternoon by Professor Duru from our Washington College of Law. I'm joined by Marsha Harper, who is the head coach of women's soccer at American. No longer newest member to our community. I think you passed that mark after 3 months and you've been here more than that. But we're glad still, Marsha, that you're here. And we have Kezan Clark, a student who is in the law school. Kizhan finished his undergraduate at American and went straight to law school. Again, one of our students who clearly has been able to really leverage as much as possible the time at American. So I'm glad to have all three of you here this afternoon. The gist of our conversation, I have been in conversation with Professor Duru, and I think in terms of context, it's important to know in particular that among scholars, Professor Duru is really one of the nation's foremost sports law authorities and teaches sports law and civil procedures and employment discrimination in our Washington College of Law. And in particular, if you go and you Google him, you would be amazed by the amount of work that he has accomplished in a range of areas and his engagement in particularly the sports arena, but also issues of discrimination and racial equity. Marsha, who comes to us from our colleagues had worked at University UMass, but also is a graduate of the University of South Florida, right? Has come to us and has had, again, a really impressive career in coaching, but also really just in the work of mentoring young people, particularly student athletes, and our deep commitment to that. And Kezan Clark, again, all you need to do is go and read The Eagle. I would encourage you to go and read The Eagle because there's a huge and a large and very important sort of article on Kezan Clark sort of journey. Very, very impressive, but also more importantly, really, I think, exemplifies, what happens when we have the resolve and when we really have a thirst for learning. First generation college student in terms of his family, and during his time at American has really had an impressive record within the wrestling team. So those are our three panelists who are with us this afternoon, and we are going to be, again, as I said, in conversation. And perhaps what might be helpful, I sometimes like to start from a little bit of a personal perspective. I think, again, we can read, the bios of each person. We know what they have in terms of credentials, but a lot of times we really don't know as much about the person. And so perhaps we could briefly go around, and if I may ask all three of you, how have you come to this work and this thirst for racial equity? What has gotten you here from your own personal lived experience, perhaps? Maybe we can start with that.
Okay, I guess I'll start it off. The reasoning behind my reasoning to be here is, I grew up in Dallas, Texas. So I was born in Wiesbaden, Germany, where there was almost no Black people. And my mom experienced, extreme levels of racism in Germany, being the only Black family in Germany, in high school and just in life by my great grandfather would treat her like crap. And so we moved to America, moved to Dallas, where there was, in my community at least, there was, Black people in the churches and schools and everywhere. So it was kind of a lot more immersive for me. And I felt a lot more ingrained into the community. And then I moved to Houston, Texas, and me and mom moved me, my mom, and my two brothers moved all over the country. Went to Tennessee, to Kentucky, not spending more than like 3 years in one place. But we ended up, sticking in Florida throughout middle school and my high school career. And that's where I kind of call home for me. So after that, I got ingrained in wrestling, and I found something that I kind of love to do, and found myself, getting a scholarship to DC in American University. And it's been great. And yes, I mean, being a part of those communities really shows me that there's a lot of justice that needs to be done for my people. And I mean, as all of us know, there's a lot of things that isn't pretty much isn't seen. And so that it's great to be able to discuss this now, because it was, always in the dark and kept in secret. So I'm happy that we're able to even have this type of discussion in today's society. So that's why I'm here.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I don't know if it's the same for you, but my picture's in the middle here, so I'll go in order. First of all, I'm very happy to be here and thankful that the invitation was extended. In terms of my background, I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. And the way that I grew up in kind of the area that I was surrounded by was predominantly white. My medium, I call sport my medium for how I'm able to connect with people, was soccer. And where the spaces that I operated in were predominantly white. And so I wasn't surrounded, nor did I see a whole lot of Black folks that look like me to model myself after. So I, grew up playing soccer, of course, obviously went to school. I was fortunate enough to get scholarships to attended college, had a fantastic time, a decent playing career, could have been better. But I was fortunate enough to be exposed to a lot of things. And I think certainly my personality and who I am and all of my core values was rooted in my experiences, much like all of us. And I think that certainly being a Black woman and navigating a predominantly white space has developed me into who I am. And I now, regardless of my student athletes, I call them my daughters, even though I'm not that old yet. Regardless of their skin color, I truly feel like, on paper, my title is soccer coach, but I truly feel like I am a life coach to them and I'm a mentor to them. So in doing that, I feel like it's really important that I teach them and speak up on issues that are really important to me. And I obviously would want them to be able to do the same thing. And I've been very excited about my team as people and how passionate, intelligent, I could rant and rave about them, but the women on my team are phenomenal. And they've absolutely used their platform to speak up on these issues surrounding racism and social injustice. So I'm here as a resource. A big reason why I want to be a part of this conversation is to anyone in our campus, in our community, big or small. I absolutely would like to be a resource to them, let alone my players. But I can talk, so I'm gonna pass it over to Dr. Duru, Professor Duru. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Coach Harper. Appreciate you passing it on to me. I too am very happy to be a part of this conversation. Very briefly, I actually grew up around here. I grew up in Tacoma Park, Maryland, just up the street, which is a pretty extraordinarily progressive community, actually, if you spend much time there. And so early on, there wasn't a whole lot in the way of racial discord that I observed personally, but I remember very distinctly when I was in the second grade, I watched Roots. I don't know if some of you haven't heard of the film Roots, made after the book by Alex Haley. You've got to see it. Anyway, it's a story of a family from with one individual being captured in West Africa, brought into chattel slavery, and the story of that family going through slavery. And I remember I was too afraid to walk home from the bus stop after I watched Roots. I was just terrified. And somehow from there, I became very obsessed with racial equity and racial justice. And so when I went through my middle school and high school, then went on to university, I studied African-American studies there, and then went to law school. I knew that I wanted to do civil rights work. And when I began practicing, not long after I began practicing, I began with an employment discrimination firm representing plaintiffs who were discriminated against based on race. And we had some coaches from the National Football League come to the firm seeking assistance. And I worked on that matter, and it showed me just how important the intersection of race and sports is, and the extent to which amplifying a social issue such as racial discrimination in employment through the sporting lens puts it on a whole different level in terms of it getting attention nationally. And I decided then that I wanted to dedicate my career to that intersection of race, sports, and law. And so I find myself here.
Thank you to all three of you. It's important to know the journey that has taken you here. So I appreciate you sharing that. Before we get into the larger conversation, there's a little slideshow that I wanted to just share with our audience, because I think we've all seen so many visuals over the last several weeks that I think this is just a good reminder of those visuals. And then I'll have each of you kind of talk to us a little bit about what is happening and how you're understanding this. So we'll have Nadia, if you don't mind, can we do the video for just a few? Yeah, the slideshow. Thank you, Nadia. All right. Well, I think it goes without saying that, athletes using their platform and their voice for social change is not a new phenomenon. I think anyone who's going to kind of read throughout history has seen that take place time and time again. And perhaps, Professor Duru, could you talk to us a little bit about some of the historical piece of this as far as it relates to athletes and social impact, and perhaps provide some context for why you think that's been the case, and also just maybe talk to us a little bit about whether you think it's been impactful and how. And then I'd like for Marsha and Kizhan to perhaps chime in terms of a bit of that.
Sure, thank you very much. So yes, I mean, what we saw a couple of weeks ago with essentially sports being brought to a grinding halt, that was extraordinary, and it was the most profound moment of protest in the history of American sports. So it absolutely was extraordinary. But as you point out, there's a long history of sport being at the forefront of a push of our society towards something more progressive, toward a better place. I mean, go back, even when people were not protesting affirmatively, but were just engaging in the athletic endeavor, because of the societal context, that in and of itself was a protest. So let's go back to almost 100 years ago to 1936, Jesse Owens in the Berlin Olympics. When he's at the Olympics, Adolf Hitler is turning Germany into a Nazi fascist regime, and he plans these Olympics for the purpose of showing everybody that the Aryan supremacist myth is reality. And Jesse Owens comes in, he wins 4 gold medals, and just doing that and standing on the podium there in Berlin in front of Adolf Hitler was a huge blow to the Aryan supremacy myth. Similarly, you go further on in history, you look at Joe Louis, the boxer, the success that he had fighting against boxers from Nazi Germany, and what story that told to people around the world about racism. And you move further on, you look at the desegregation of sports in this country, and you look at people, we've heard their stories of Jackie Robinson in baseball, Sweetwater Clifton in the NBA, and Bill Willis and others in the NFL. These individuals were the first and among the first to play their sport as a person of color in a largely white sport. And just playing presented an argument that, well, if we can play together on fields, maybe there's a world in which we can work together in the same office buildings and live in the same neighborhoods and attend the same schools. So in many ways, it was a bit of a symbolic beginning to the civil rights movements that we saw continuing on through the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s. And you move further on, you know, this is not something that's just relegated to race. If you look at the great tennis player, Billie Jean King, and what she did for the equal pay movement for women is more than 100 politicians could have done with her tennis career and the stands that she took. And then you move more recently, and we think about Colin Kaepernick 4 years ago. People are now saying he was ahead of his time. Or was it that he was ahead of his time, or did he push the times forward such that we got to a place where what happened a couple of weeks ago was possible? And then we saw a couple of weeks ago, and we saw the extraordinary statement that made. All those, the collage that you had on the screen there. You know, it's in doing what these athletes did, they forced the sports world to recognize their necessity to it. And in doing so, proved without a doubt their import to the entire industry. And in doing that, forced the industry to recognize their humanity. So it's an extraordinary moment. What we see, you know, sports is not, you know, with all due respect to, you know, insurance sales or, software engineering. When there are breakthroughs in sport, because of its platform, everybody sees it. And so I think what that means is that those of us involved in sport have an obligation to use that platform in a way to level the playing field and push our society into a better place.
Do either one of you want to chime in on this on this conversation or on the platform piece?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and, you know, just to kind of echo what he was mentioning, we all on a very human level, regardless of the color of our skin, and certainly when you get down to on the granular level of resource and access, it's tough for some people to visually see things, but we all enjoy sport. And so when you talk about change, I think a big reason that change happens is because there's a commonality or something common that people engage in with one another to be able to go ahead and push the needle to create change. And I think that sport is something that unites people. And so I think that it's a very powerful tool. And that's something that I'm certainly thankful that it's heavily involved in my life and my work. Like I said before, I use sport and soccer specifically as a medium to connect with the women on my team and try and influence them. And I think that that's something that you'll see with the collage that was shown is, you know, whether it's LeBron James or Naomi or any of the athletes that we've seen, their influence, you know, and who they are and how great they are in their particular area connects other people with them. So now if those individuals are speaking or even visually showing something that's related to racism or social injustice and change in that area, then it makes people at least think. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that's really important, is that's a starting point. Obviously we want to get to the action piece, but we first have to connect with people. And I think that getting them to think about something in a way that's different than how they've maybe thought about it before is the starting point. So platform in sport is very powerful, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I agree with like everything that Professor Duru and Coach Harper were saying. I mean, ever since the beginning of time, I mean, people have been using sports to kind of, you know, influence people, and this isn't anything new. And ever since the beginning, people have kind of been ridiculed for, you know, some of the actions they've taken, you know, to speak out against something they see as wrong. For example, Tommy Smith and John Carlos during the, you know, 68 Olympics, you know, when they rose their fists during the national anthem, they were immediately sent home. And, you know, we saw with Colin Kaepernick, everyone saw how, you know, he's peacefully protesting. You know, he kneeled during the national anthem, and he got, you know, ridiculed by the whole nation for something that he saw as wrong. He was just peacefully protesting. It's not like he was, you know, saying anything to anybody, and it's gonna be it's gonna suck. You're gonna have to sacrifice, you know. I've realized that if you're gonna speak out against, you know, something, you're probably gonna sacrifice, you know, probably your reputation, or you know, just your you know, there's gonna have to be sacrifice for that change to come. And, you know, a lot of people don't want that change to happen. So if yeah, a lot of people aren't gonna want that change to happen. So people are gonna get ridiculed, but it's up to us and other athletes to fight for what we think is right. You know, the NFL just apologized for, you know, putting fines against players who kneel during the national anthem. And, you know, it takes, you know, fighting through that for us to get to what Coach Harper was saying, that endpoint that we want to see, that change that we want to see. So it's going to take sacrifice, but it takes people who are willing to fight for it to get there, you know.
So let me ask then this question, particularly within sports. You know, I think certainly within the American context, maybe even more than some of the other contexts that I've lived in, money has quite a bit of influence. You know, I think it's quite, you know, I think we all know how much revenue, how much sort of the business model that exists within the sports world. And so I'm curious to understand a little bit more about how do you think that's impacting some of the change that we're seeing, particularly in recent time? You're hearing about, you know, managers of these sports teams that really in many ways command millions and millions of dollars, who now have aligned themselves, right, with the athletes, who in many ways are at the forefront of the movement in the athletics arena. Talk to us a little bit more about the role of this, the money part of this, and how much influence it has both ways, either influence in not advancing change or having the potential to advance change, because now people have to stop and understand what is the bottom line that could emanate from this if change doesn't happen. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
You looked like he was going to say something, but you know, were you going to say something? You want to hop in first?
First, Coach Harper, I'll go next.
All right. You know, I think that athletes, particularly those who are at the top of their sport, when you talk about influence, it is to those that are being suppressed, obviously, you know, them seeing someone that looks like them and empowering them to maybe speak up, like Kizhan was saying, right? But also it has influence on those people who hold power to be able to make the actual change that we need to see. And so money is a very powerful thing also. And so those athletes, for example, LeBron James, right? You know, multi-million-dollar individual himself, but he has his brand, right? His name and his brand is associated with so many things. So many people who are in positions of power to make decisions have or are associated with him. So now with him deciding, you know, for better or for worse for himself personally, financially, he's made a stance. And those companies and those people or organizations that are attached with him have a decision to make. Okay, do we want to go ahead and stick with this athlete and his message and his voice, or are we going to try and separate ourselves? And if we do, and I think that's something that's awesome right now that's happening, because it's such a movement in more of a way than we've ever seen before, those people who might, or organizations who might detach from him, I mean, then they're going to have a negative you know, connotation associated with them. So then there's like money lost. Okay. But also money can be gained. I mean, right. So it's something that I think that as athletes and using sport as a tool to make change and promote change, we can absolutely use leverage, right? Our positioning and our platform is leverage to be able to, you know, kind of create that catalyst for change. And money can, you know, sway people. We've seen in so many different areas of our world and our life. And so I think that right now, it's more important than ever, you know, especially if as an athlete, such as LeBron James, who is that power, you know, he can take some financial hits, you know, some of his, you know, I can't even think of something that he's associated with, but he is in a spot where he's decided personally, it's such a movement that's so attached to him personally that he is willing to risk it all, so to speak. You hear a lot of people say that. So I'm gonna stop there.
Professor Duru.
Yeah, no, I agree with Coach Harper. I think, Coach Harper spoke about money, having the power to sway people. And I don't think that there's a more poignant or illustrative example of that than what happened just a month or so ago in this city, which is for decades, people have been trying to get the Washington football team to change its name through lawsuits, through grassroots organizing, through picketing, through everything. Club refused. New owner, club still refused. The new owner, current owner said, and I quote, "This name will never change."
Okay.
Never, you can put it in caps, he told the reporter, "will never change," okay? Then this spring happens, and all of us get turned upside down, right? Those same individuals who've been putting pressure for years on the club went to FedEx, which their field is named after, and other big sponsors, and applied pressure and said, "What's happening? The name of this club is racist and it's wrong, and it's got to change." And the sponsors said, "Yeah, I think it should change." And the sponsors then said that to the owner, and 2 weeks later, he said, "I'm going to change it." This somebody said it would never change. And I don't think were it not for the screws being turned financially, it ever would have changed. So without question, money speaks volumes. Maybe we wish in society it didn't, but it sure does. And we're seeing that in this moment.
Yes, and I love that saying, apply pressure, mostly because I'm a wrestler and that's all our coaches scream at us during practice is pressure, pressure, pressure. But yes, that's the truth. I mean, we feel that pressure negatively when the NCAA bans us from doing certain things, like using our name to like even using our own name. That was just a privilege given to us like a couple years ago as athletes, or when the NFL was fined all the athletes who knelt during the national anthem, that they're trying to apply pressure to us to change. But us, as athletes, if we work past that pressure, we're able to, make a change in the positive. Like athletes, as NCAA athletes, we apply pressure that we should be able to use our own name, for, financial benefits or, anything we want to use our name for. It's just our right. NFL players, applied the pressure by kneeling and just taking on the fines on the face and sacrificing their finances to fight for something they thought is right. So they apply pressure back to the NFL, and we see NBA players who are applying pressure to the NBA to with their when they have Black Lives Matter written on their jerseys and everything. And now we see how we're applying pressure in the positive way. But at the beginning, you're probably gonna get pressure in the negative way. You just gotta notice that the change that you want is going to be worth that, that pressure you're taking on. So I just love that saying, Professor Duru, and I'm just going to kind of implement that in my life from now on.
So thank you to all three of you. I guess my question is, we've acknowledged the fact that, athletes and taking a stance and taking a position, in particular around racial equity, is not a new phenomenon. We've cited examples after examples. We've talked about this time being a movement, and somewhat, and we've seen that movement. The visuals continue as we speak. My question to the three of you is, what is different or similar now versus in the past? Is there a generational part to this? Is there a time sort of capsule that has changed? And what does that sort of signal to you when you think about the past and you think about now in terms of this piece of athletes and taking a stance on racial equity? What has changed, if any?
I'm gonna let you guys take this one because I haven't lived enough life to say how much change there's been.
Well, at least you can speak to your generation after, because I think it's
Yeah.
important. There's a generational piece I suspect here. So we'll have you at least speak to the present.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
I guess my initial superficial assessment makes me believe I'm the oldest person on this call. So maybe I go first. I mean, although even Kizhan, even I wasn't old enough to.
You might not be Professor Duru, but that's between.
You know what I think it was. With the sorts of. So Kizhan mentioned John Carlos and Tommy Smith in 1968. And they weren't the only activist athletes of the time. You had Jim Brown of the National Football League. You had Bill Russell, National Basketball Association. You had Kurt Flood, Major League Baseball. You had a number of activist athletes. And I think that they were responding to what was that moment. And me, I grew up, I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up, of course, I studied that moment that they lived through. But it was always something that I didn't live through. It was the civil rights movement. It was a civil rights battle. I spoke of it in the past tense. As much as I read and studied, I still viewed it that way. And, these last few years, you begin to realize that it's all part of a continuum. And I've talked to people, Kizhan, who are twice my age, who have been through it. And they cry as much about what's going on now, they say, as they did in the mid 60s. And so I think as I'm not sure how to put it. I mean, as the narrative began that we were moving toward a post-racial era, that the civil rights movement was something in the past, we'd moved beyond that. I think across society, you had less protests, certainly less athlete protests. 80s, 90s, very little of it. Some, but not much. Early 2000s, very little. But as we have seen over the course of the last decade or so, I think a lot of it has to do, quite frankly, with the creation of these cameras and phones that everybody has. So everybody can record things that previously were not being recorded. We're seeing that we're still beset by much of the same racial discord we've always been beset by. And so as that visual, that optic has blasted folks in the face, including athletes, another protest movement kind of has been born. And so I think what you're seeing is what was a latent, something that was latent has kind of been brought to the fore. And I think for me, in my view, the key, and maybe we may talk about this, but what's next moving forward is that this moment, as many people have said, not remain a moment and that it become a movement and that it carries on. I think it would be unfortunate if in the late 2020s and the 2030s and the 2040s, athletes receded from protest, because I feel quite certain that sadly, our racial problems will not recede during that period of time. So hopefully what's going on now can be something that carries forward and we don't have a latency period, but we continue to systemically utilize sport as a means of protest.
I think building on top of that, specifically the part that you mentioned about, camera phones and videos and all of that, I think a lot of people, I've been involved in a lot of discussions, especially right now surrounding racism and social injustice. And a lot of people have asked the question, what makes now different? And I think there's the combination of video, right? Especially starting with George Floyd's death. It was something that was filmed. And I am curious, I've thought about this also myself, if we weren't all in a pandemic, if we weren't all at home, if we weren't all sitting, waiting for things to happen, if we wouldn't have seen that, right? If we're all, living our normal lives on go, 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 if we all wouldn't have had the impact of seeing that video and the impact of that being spread, and talk about the internet, right? And social media, all of these things. It was blasted everywhere. And I think that's, again, when you talk about creating change, for me, I think you have to have some common thread. And we all, as humans, have a common thread of emotion. And seeing that, it drew a lot of emotion from all races. And that's something that you couldn't deny. And I think that that really sparked a lot of people to, if they hadn't already, flip the mirror around and say, wow, what am I doing? How am I helping? How am I not helping? Where do I kind of fall on that scale? And so for me, when reflecting upon that question, I think it's a combination of where we are in just as a society. I mean, literally, quite literally, you know, and all the technological advances that have, it was kind of like the perfect storm. I hate to use that terminology, but it was that we're able to have this moment and live this moment, a much needed moment. And so it's interesting to think about, but I certainly am curious if the perfect storm hadn't happened, if we would be in this moment. And I'm so obviously very thankful that we are. But I think that it's also generational. One thing, you know, all of the women that I coach on my team are very passionate, very adamant, and they've used their platform. When we talk about, you know, generationally, they all, and me included, use social media. And that's a generational thing, right? And they have all been using their individual platforms, all the resources that they know of, to create this change and to get the word out. And so I think that that's something, at least maybe Kizhan, you can speak on your generational kind of side of things. But that's something that the women on my team certainly have been doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the coming of social media and just the internet has made a big change in, you know, how information is spread, and, you know, now you can gain you can reach thousands of people and click a button in seconds. It's crazy. And you know, you just couldn't do that back in the day. Like, you couldn't just get in front of a TV and speak to a bunch of people. I mean, TV, you had to rely on TV broadcasters, I guess, but who is that run by? You know, you got to follow what they say to tell you to say. But now everyone can, you know, be uncensored and say what they want to say, say what they want to feel, or and organize things. Like, I can reach all my friends or anyone in the DC area to organize, you know, a protest or, you know, something that I believe in. So I think, yeah, that change in social media definitely has created great changes for society, because you can't hide anymore. You have cameras, you have, you know, witnesses, anyone could, you know, send out a text at any point, and it's amazing. And it really is. So I think that's the biggest change, is just social media and the internet. It's just, you know, created a whole different way to medium to just speak to people and reach people. So
with that, I'm going to open up the floor to discussion from our audience. And so for our audience participants, it would be easier if you use the chat section, if you can all see the chat section, and you can have your questions for all panelists and attendees. And while I wait for questions to come in, let me see. I'll just take a minute here and see if there's any questions that are coming in. Because while I wait for maybe questions to come in, I have a question. And it goes back to what, you know, Professor Duru talked about, which is, you know, the difference between a moment and a movement. And this is a question I think a lot of us are frankly asking ourselves. Hold on 1 minute on the Q&A. Chat is disabled, but Q&A is available. So please, for those who wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A part of the Zoom so that we can get your questions, please. And I'm looking at this. Dismiss. I'm not. Okay, so while we wait for, I have a question again. The difference between, you know, a moment and a movement, and the question that I have for all three of you, and this is really a candid question on my part. Do you have hope that this is really where that change is coming, and that specifically, given the platform that those in athletics have had? And we've talked about, you know, sort of the intersection of sports as a unifier and what that does in bringing people together and the visibility that it brings to things. And we've also talked about the financial impact that sport can have, both, you know, the ability to stop things on the tracks and or to generate more resources and the technology that is now afforded all of us in a way that perhaps we didn't have access to. Do you believe that sports and athletics and athletes and managers and everything that's involved in that this time around there is really hope for more fundamental changes?
Well, I'll say, I have to say that I've been a little bit low on hope as of late, just with the extent to which our nation is fractured. It's very, very dispiriting and challenging. But hope rings eternal, and so I think we have to be hopeful. And I have to say, I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm so impassioned about this, that if there's an area that can push us forward, I feel like it's sport. And the reason I say that is because our nation is so fractured that in some cases, sport is the one thing that brings, and it goes to what Coach Harper was saying, sport is the one thing that brings people from different ideological, racial, socioeconomic backgrounds together. And so if you can get to, look, Coach Harper, would you shift a little bit so everybody can see what's behind you? So you look at the beautiful picture there of Coach Harper's players. You've got a multiracial group of players holding each other, talking about their approach. Okay, Coach Harper, we're good. Talking about their approach to working together to accomplish something. We don't know what all those individuals have seen, where they've been, what they've done, but they are together now. And there are very few things that allow that sort of togetherness. And so in that we're so fractured, and in that sport demands that sort of togetherness, I think if we're going to have hope moving forward, sport must be a part of that movement.
I also, there are, and speaking candidly, I think that it is, it comes in waves for me, the hope. And I think that so as long as there continues to be people, and specifically athletes and people involved in sports, standing up in promoting change, in a way that's visual, of course, but also vocally speaking about it, then that helps the train keep going, right? But if we all, my worry is that when life resumes to quote unquote somewhat normalcy, that we all become too busy and it kind of falls by the wayside. And so that's something that I'm hoping that people, especially involved in sport, as it's our topic, continue to push for change. And something that I think, people should do is speak about these topics, but what are some action steps that we could be taking? And so for me, I'm really passionate about, trying to end systemic racism. And within that, policy, right? That's something that, in policy, big and small, whether it be, code of conduct or anything like that, given various parts of wherever we all operate. But I think taking action steps to end systemic racism is hopefully what will create long-lasting change. And I think that's something that we should all kind of focus on. And again, just making sure that we're continuing to use our voice and our platform, but when life gets busy again, to make sure that we all are in some way, not just speaking about it, but taking action steps. And if that doesn't happen, if that part doesn't happen, then I fear that this will just be a moment. So it's about the action. We hear people say that, but we need to remember that, and it needs to hold true when we all get busy again.
There's a couple of questions and I'll start with you, Kizhan. What's the best way to help students athletes navigate making social change? Because again, I think this is an important question because it's the operative word, students and athletes, right? Both. Mm-hmm. And so it is sometimes there's high responsibility that's on the shoulders of those who are more visible. And so this question in particular has come in, and we're interested in hearing some of your thoughts around that.
Yeah, well, I think what's important for us as student athletes is to, first, you want to listen. You want to listen to what people are saying. you want to listen, you want to educate yourself, which is very important. You want to make sure you're getting, the full story and not just, the headline. And that's the one thing I wanted to touch on too about the generational changes, is that nowadays, people attention span are so low that, they just want to read the headline and be like, oh, I'm going with that. Really educate yourself. And after you're done listening and educating yourself and getting the full picture, you're able to then spread that knowledge onto other people. So I think if you have those 3 steps, take those 3 steps, then I feel like you'll contribute to the social change, the best way that you can as a student athlete, and just not just a student athlete, like anybody can listen, educate themselves, and educate others. So I think that's really important. Those are 3 really important things that anyone can do, not just student athletes.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how have you seen coaches integrate civic leadership or social change methodology within their coaching pedagogy? And this is for you, Coach Harper.
I figured.
Doing that.
I have been quoted as saying, I really truly feel like my job, of course, is to be a role model, but more so promote my student athlete's voice. And and especially within this topic, have been leading from the back. And so I've allowed the women on my team to push forward because they very much are full steam ahead, which I love. And my job is to show them the way. And if they, fall off the path a little bit, okay, I'll bring them back on the path, but they're very much driven to do that. And of course, again, as life gets busy and they start in school again and all these different things involved in their life, whether it's work, family, all those things, remind them, hey, this is important to you. What is important to you? If you say this is important to you, you got to make sure that you're giving time and energy to those areas. And so I think my role as a coach is to amplify their voice, but also remind them, hey, like, what are we doing? And the women on my team have been fantastic about putting forth ideas and initiatives that we could do, hopefully when our season happens again. And that's a lot what we're seeing right now, especially with the professional sports. You're seeing athletes, whether it's kneeling or wearing warm-up tops or masks with obviously names and branding. That's certainly an action step that we can take, but I would say my job and what I've been doing thus far with my women is amplifying their voice and also reminding them of things that they've brought up. But very much allowing them to use the platform. That's another thing that I think that regardless of sport or whatever our level is, that there might be some uncomfortable topics or, this is an uncomfortable topic for some people. And I think letting people be uncomfortable with that, but also acknowledging and supporting, especially if our student athletes are saying things and they're asking for help, really supporting them, right? And even if it's an uncomfortable thing, or even if like, I don't know if, the greater picture is okay with that, like saying, hey, you still have your voice, you still have your platform, go ahead and do that, right? But teaching them how to be mindful of navigating the spaces that we operate in, right? And that's something that I personally have had to do growing up, given the kind of context that I grew up in and the spaces that I grew up in. You hear people talk about code switching, right? And being able to be grounded in oneself and know that you're where you are and where you come from, but also the predominant culture that we live in is white. And so you have to, Kizhan was saying, educate yourself. That is crucial to any race. Educate yourself, but also understand that you're working with different people and you have to have the emotional intelligence, that's another term, right? To be able to navigate those spaces and work with people to get them to understand and educate people to get them to understand the goal that you're going for. So that was a lot. I don't know if that answered the question, but I would just say support.
So that leads me to a question that I wanted to kind of follow up with, and particularly with Professor Duru. I mean, you are in the legal field and you have been working in this area for a long time, and particularly around issues of discrimination, as we've briefly talked about. And so let's hope that it is, in fact, it is a movement, and that it's a movement that is an ongoing movement, I think, as many have described. But while that is going on, I think issues of discrimination remains, and in particular, in every part of our lives and every sector that you can imagine. What is it that is important for us to continue to remember in this space, particularly as it relates to athletes and issues of discrimination in particular?
Well, I think you mentioned the loss. I mean, I think that a thing to keep in mind, and also perhaps something that gives us hope, is that there has been created, notwithstanding this nation's history and its birth out of a system of chattel slavery, there have, over the course of the last couple of centuries, really the last century, come into existence laws that are protective. Now, it's not always the case that they're enforced, and it's not always the case that those who are appointed to courts are going to interpret them in the way in which they came into force, but they're there. And so it's our duty, I say mine as a civil rights lawyer, to recognize what laws, what statutes can be used to challenge inequity and discrimination that you mentioned, and to leverage those and push them through the courts with creative theories. When you had look at the Brown versus Board of Education decision, everybody should be familiar with that. The lawyers based at Howard Law School across town came up with creative theories to try to get to a place where we could fight off and end segregation in schools. And it's important to know, at the time, there really wasn't such a thing as a civil rights lawyer. You know, you had lawyers who were family lawyers, and you had corporate lawyers, you had personal injury lawyers, all of whom were interested in and concerned about the horrible racial disparities that existed. And so they came together from doing something else creatively to essentially become civil rights lawyers and push through one of the landmark legal cases that we've had. So I say that to say, that the raw materials for progress exist. And it's up to us as individuals to seize upon those. Two, no matter what our area of focus is, if we are concerned about these issues, to seize upon the raw materials, to come together and engage these issues together, and to push for progress. That, even saying that, makes me feel more hopeful, because I think there is, I mean, the foundation is there for us to reach a society that, to reach a place in society that is the place that many of us, certainly all of us on this call, have long, hoped that we'd already be at.
Thank you. One of our colleagues, I think was more of a comment, talked about is equating, student athletes and professional athletes having perhaps somewhat similar commitment to serve as the way members of the U.S. military tends to kind of think about, sort of civic patriotism. And so that's one of the comments that just came in, and I just wanted to flag that. The other piece is, do you and your team members talk about systemic racism? Is a question that's coming up. Can the African-American athletes coaches educate the white athletes and even coaches about 400 years of racism in the US? That's a big one to take on. The question is, should you even be taking that on is another question I would add to this. And Professor Duru, I'll need you to chime in, particularly because on the civil rights side, this is a big part of, where does the responsibility needs to shift, and how does that look in this sort of day and age?
I guess I'll speak on particularly my team. My coach allows us to speak. He doesn't shy away from the discussion. It's right in our face. So, he allows us to, he gives us an open form of communication. We have weekly meetings where we can discuss these topics, and we do discuss these topics and share things that will educate our teammates, because most of our teammates are white, but they can have just as much of an impact as, us or me or the black teammates, my black teammates. Everyone can have just the same amount of, of an effect on social change and social justice and racial equality. Everyone can have the same amount of change. Privileged people can have can have a change. You know, it's not, you don't have to be just a Black person to make a change towards, you know, progress. Anyone can make this change. So it's not just a Black white thing. It's everyone can do it. Everyone realizes the issue, you know, and everyone can discuss it and educate people on it. So there is no Black white issue there.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and say, with my team in particular, we've had several conversations surrounding racism and social injustice, and systemic racism is an area that I think that I would love to keep the conversation going. I mean, certainly on my team, but just in general. My team is quite diverse given the demographic of soccer itself, which is awesome. But the Black woman on my team came to me and asked if they could essentially take over a team meeting, which I was like, yeah, good. I'm tired of hearing myself talk, right? But they asked if they could take control essentially, and they wanted to create an open forum for everyone on our team, regardless of the color of their skin, to ask questions, right? So especially when this first happened, I would say, when this became a larger issue, well, I shouldn't say larger issue, when it came to light, there was a lot of discomfort, right, around the topic. And so they wanted to kind of dismantle that by putting it on the table. And so the woman on my team in particular essentially created a Google Doc where their teammates could submit anonymous questions. And they took the answers from those that doc and created a PowerPoint to answer some of the questions that were thrown out, which was awesome because it created a safe space for their teammates to learn. When we talk about educate, that is one of the most important things, because that's something that, in order for someone to want to be a part of change, they have to understand what they're doing or why does it add value to them. So there's a portion of the educational piece right there. But talking about systemic racism, again, is something that I'm very passionate about. And I'm actually a part of our athletic department is a part of the Patriot League. That's the league in which and Dr. Duru is also upon this.
Dr. Duru, yeah.
And we are looking at some ways that we can categorically break it down and continue the conversation. And I'm actually in the educational initiatives working group. And we're talking about things, when you talk about voting, right? And educating people on voting, and what are some things that we can do surrounding voting, regardless of your party, but just educating people on your right to vote and why we should vote. That addresses systemic racism from a very specific action. So just things like that, holding town halls, building relationships amongst the Black community and law enforcement. That's again something that we can talk about, and we're working towards. But little things like that with my team in particular, we want to continue to talk about specifically systemic racism, but specific action steps that we can be doing.
Okay.
Did you want me to say something?
Yes, I was going to you. Yes, please, Professor Duru.
I'll be very brief. I'll just say that I'm thrilled to hear that Kizhan's coach has opened up the space to discuss these matters and recognizes the need for exploring systemic racism. And I'm thrilled that Coach Harper does that with her players. And Coach Harper mentioned that initially there was discomfort when the issue came and exploded in this nation this spring. And it's understandable that there'd be discomfort. It's unfortunate, but the reason there's discomfort is because people are raised without exploring these 400 years, without thinking about it, without being taught about it. And so if we have an educational system which for the most part does not emphasize these 400 years, you'll have this discomfort. And so I think it is the obligation of all of us to get down to brass tacks and talk about it. This is what we've experienced. We're all in this country now. We're all in the same boat now, but this has been the experience. Let's understand that and try to move forward together. So I'm really pleased to hear the wrestling program and the soccer program here at AU. I really like what I'm seeing.
So we're coming to almost the end, and I want to kind of leave with one question. This is an interesting one. How do we get more people of color in the owners' box? And I would like you to answer that, and and in finishing up, in terms of the closing out, racial battle fatigue is real. And all of you are involved and engaged in all different facets of it. What do you do to preserve your energy in that process, to keep going? So one is, how do we get owners into the owners' box? More Black folks into the owners' box is one question. And then two, knowing that racial battle fatigue is real, what do you do and how do you go about preserving yourself in this climate and environment?
Well, I guess talking about, because it's similar, I think, and tied to what we've been talking about, but getting more Black people in the owner's box. I think addressing specific issues of systemic racism, right? Where it's getting education so that people can put themselves and educate themselves in positions that will get them, and it comes down to resources, but get them in spots where they are able to have capital, whether it be financial or intellectual, to get into those spaces. So educating people and giving people opportunity, right? That's another thing. And then I guess, do you want me to jump on the other?
Yeah, jump on the other one. Yeah. So
it's certainly,
around.
Yeah, the battle fatigue, is that how it was?
Yeah.
I actually love that. It's very real. Speaking candidly, it's very real. And there's times where I have had to talk to myself, and say, because it's a lot. It's a lot to be Black right now. And I've had to, I found comfort in speaking to my mom, of course, as mothers are, but other Black people, and just talking about our shared experience and kind of, telling each other, hey, we got to keep going. We got to keep carrying the torch, so to speak. And actually, it's, for me personally, there is things that I've been seeing and I love it. I was watching Hidden Figures on TV the other day. I think it was on TNT, but for me, that really hit home and resonated, because there's been women and Black men that have come before me that have done a lot more, cumbersome work than what I feel like my work is right now. So it's just another reminder that there's people who have done a lot before me to get me in this position of power, and quote unquote an owner's box in a way, if you will, in an influential position to be able to educate and bring other people along. So for me, I've certainly had that battle fatigue, and I'm sure that I will moving forward, but I'm fortunate because I've seen things and have talked to people that have made me realize it's greater than me and my fatigue, my momentary fatigue. So I'm thankful to be able to be in a position to experience that fatigue, but also be quickly moved out of that fatigue. So.
I guess I'll speak next. I mean, in terms of trying to get, more Black people in owner's box, I guess I'm trying to do that myself by, tackling law school and trying to reach a profession that's dominated by white people. I know Professor Duru probably, understands that firsthand. I mean, 80% of lawyers are white. There's not many Black people who, reach that, career path. And that really does hurt us in terms of, representing people who make up the corrections and everything. What I'm trying to get into is criminal justice. And I mean, you see the prisons, it's mostly Black people and they're being served by white people. And it's kind of like a disconnect in that terms. And I feel like me trying to do what I'm trying to do is going to help my community by just one representation, on both sides. And I feel like when I do reach my potential that I want to reach, I feel like I know I will give back to my community in a way that, in an important way. I can educate people on the importance of just education, really, and ways that they can get to the point that where I am, and just give information, have talks like these, and there's a lot of things that I can do, and I know me, myself, I influence others, and I know how important it is to be that leader. And I'm kind of taking on trying to teaching myself basically how to become that leader. And there's a lot of things that I need to improve on myself, and I know that. But I know that the steps that I'm taking are really important, not just for myself, but for countless others. And so that kind of pushes me to, push past my limits and, to reach my potentials. And the way I get past, this fatigue is, I mean, I love wrestling, and that's how I get past like pretty much any fatigue when it comes to even law school, when I'm just, soaked with cases and memos and stuff. I, go in the practice room, and, nothing, blows off steam more than just beating up somebody. So, I mean, that's kind of how I kind of blow off some of that fatigue that I have. And it works out for me pretty well. So.
Yeah, I'll say on the ownership piece, one of the big challenges is that there are substantial built-in headwinds to Black people becoming owners. If you think about the money involved, so the National Football League, the last team that got sold was the Carolina Panthers. That sold for $2.4 billion, $2.4 billion with the B. In order, under NFL rules, in order for you to buy a club and therefore to be the owner, the general partner, you can have a partnership group, but the general partner, the person who's the head of the group, has to have 1/3 of that amount in liquid, $800 million in liquid, okay? So when you look at the headwinds that Black people have faced in this country, where emancipation was not that long ago, and the end of the de jure segregation was not that long ago, to have the generational wealth to build up $800 million, that's a tough nut to crack. And consequently, there aren't a lot of people who are able to put up the money. And so I think one thing we need to do is call on leagues to get, so that rule is not a race-based rule, but it has a disparate impact on Black people because of the structural racism we've talked about. So we need to call on leagues to change rules in a way that at least tries to level the playing field somewhat. With respect to battle fatigue, I agree with both of my colleagues on this panel. It is real. I think we all have to take care of ourselves. Those of us who are kind of fighting these battles have to take care of ourselves. Which is, do the things that you enjoy doing, whether it's wrestling, whether it's coaching or playing, whether it's hanging out with, playing with your children, whatever it is to recharge you. Then the other piece that helps me is, as dark as these days are, there were darker days. There have been darker days, and people were able to battle through those. And so we have to do our best to battle through these.
Thank you so much to all three of you. It has been just, for me, I'm humbled to have had the opportunity to spend an hour with all three of you. And I really do leave, particularly with everything that you all have said. I think, Professor Duru, this reminder that, yes, these are dark days, but we have seen darker days. And the hope that can hopefully come from that is something that I hope can sustain us. And to all three of you, please be well, take care of yourselves. And thank you for giving us this hour and for giving us this gift of your time. We very much appreciate it. And to all our participants, thank you for joining us this afternoon for a conversation. And I hope that you will join us again for other conversations that are ongoing. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you to all three of you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Aw. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.